Um, our group, we had 4 people in it, and Baruch joined us on occasion to observe and contribute. Uh, our working title was Solving Climate Change, Keeping Your Head Above Water, because that's what's happening is the seas are rising slowly and could be accelerating. Our main problem is, or our big problem is this is really one of the big existential threats to our planet as we look forward just really just a few decades or even centuries given the consequence. The Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, has said that we are speeding on the highway to climate crisis. So while we recognize that we're in a dire situation, we're driving fast over the cliff. The big measurement that we track is the Keeling curve. It was started by Charles Keeling in the mid 50s, and it said at that point in time we had 300 parts per million of CO2, and today we are at 420. So we've increased 35% in my lifetime, which is an extraordinary pace of change in atmospheric chemistry in such a short period of time. Uh, uh, you could call it a lot of things. It's been called a hothouse Earth is what we've been created. And if you just look at the news today, that is pretty evident in the fires and the floods and the droughts around the world. All of these things are increasing fires, flooding, too much water, too little water with droughts, damaging biodiversity, coral reefs, melting glaciers, and rising sea levels. Uh, it is a laundry list of bad consequences that occurs from this condition. The two nations that have to grapple this are the US and China. Uh, we are half of the world's CO2 today. So if we're going to solve this, it's going to be those two nations working together, and then followed closely by India. The unserved, for those that, especially those 600 million that talked about in Africa, they have to totally skip the the fossil fuel step and go directly to renewables. The preferred state, Ellie was going to join us, but she has a mandatory class that she's in right now. So I'm going to do the preferred state as well quickly. Most of us know what that is. What we'd like to do is get off of fossil fuels entirely, to stop funding them, to stop burning them, and switch entirely to renewables. So we'd like to see a 100% renewable planet. It would be great by 2050. That's a challenging number, but that would be terrific. And electrify all buildings, all transportation would be running on electricity, not burning a fossil fuel to do that. That will require clearly several things. We'll need to modernize the grid so that we can accommodate large wind in the developed world. We've seen those already where you need new transmission to get those large wind farms and solar farms to our homes and businesses. That'll be different for the developing world. They need small scale microgrid solar and wind so they can do that right there in their villages, and skip the fossil fuel step entirely. We need efficiency in everything, especially buildings. That's the biggest waste for I guess, heat and electricity in our culture today are the buildings that we've already built. So massive efficiency changes need to go there. And then we need to reforest our world. If we reforest our world, that is the natural way to take carbon out of the atmosphere, so we can get back to a preferred state of at least 350 parts per million of CO2. That's a designation made by Dr. James Hansen and many others, that we would then have an ongoing sustainable planet.
All right, so regarding the solution, our solution, the main core of it is three parts. We will completely transition to EVs for new road vehicles by 2035 and electrify the world's railway networks by 2040. We'll generate 100% of all electricity from renewable energy sources by 2050, and all subsidies of fossil fuels, $7 trillion, according to the IMF, will be canceled and transferred to renewable energy initiatives. So how this will work is we will, in terms of programs, policies, and technology needed, we'll use the precedent of EV policies from California and the EU, which should be replicated around the world. These policies state that, for example, by 2035, all new production cars must be electrified, new production road vehicles, excuse me, and or at least be zero emission. And these kinds of policies very closely mirror our plan. So using the steps in place in those areas to take us to the next level of electrification will be a major priority. For railroad electrification, we'll take the example of India, where 45% of its railway network just in the last 5 years has been newly electrified, to the point that around 80 to 90% electrification, 60,000 kilometers of its 68,000 has been electrified in total. And the techniques behind this can be clearly imitated in the rest of the world, where Britain and the US have failed to do so in good time. Now, obviously, there are a lot of countries without the funds and political wherewithal to facilitate this. So we'll help reach out to development banks and IGOs like the World Bank, the IMF, and the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank in order to, in cooperation with companies and national governments, in order for them to develop financial strategies that both help the recipient while ensuring local self-sufficiency. The investing company or organization will receive a minority share in the initiatives produced by the strategy so that their investments can be passed on, quote unquote, to the country or government involved. This goes for all other initiatives that we describe as well in terms of other electrification and energy. Now, in terms of energy, we will help facilitate the implementation of financial incentives for companies to invest in the research and development of renewables such as solar, nuclear, and hydroelectric power, as well as the construction of these plants in environmentally friendly locations, which will make our solution economically advantageous to corporations. The resources allocated to the Green Climate Fund will increase specifically for renewable energy projects, which will provide grants and loans for companies implementing these solutions. The example of California and Minnesota will be followed in implementing incentives and policies for renewable energy sources, such as the renewable portfolio standards for all public utilities and setting the deadline and a minimum percentage of retail electricity to be generated using renewable sources. California's Senate Bill 100 or SB 100, excuse me, is a good precedent for this. We will help this well, excuse me, I'm saying we, I'm characterizing this as an effort of us, where in fact it has to be done in cooperation with many governments. Tax incentives will be used for purchasing EVs by national and supranational governments, as well as for companies.
Par rapport à
Yes.
Go ahead, Ben.
Um, excuse me. And as well as tax incentives for companies manufacturing EVs and renewable energy will make our solution economically beneficial for producers and consumers alike. There will be education programs implemented about the benefits of EVs and of renewable energy, which will garner public support, while training programs will teach the necessary skills to workers switching from internal combustion engine vehicles and fossil fuel production to EV and renewable energy production. We will help encourage the implementation of more EV charging ports, which last around 10 to 20 years, depending on quality, usage, and environment and maintenance, which produces a very worthwhile investment for our future that will last long term. So resources needed. Money and funds will, of course, be needed, which will be achieved through both the strategies described in the implementation further down the line of this presentation and the policies and strategies stated above. Manpower is also necessary to facilitate these strategies, which will be gained in small-scale initiatives through community support and in local employment, and for large-scale one, in the form of major corporations and straight-run infrastructure initiatives such as those in China. Materials such as glass, conductive metals, steel, and while lithium is currently being used for batteries, increasingly sodium, which is both more renewable and more common in our crust, are required to manufacture the plants, modules, and reactors that generate renewable energy. Open farmlands, rivers, geothermal hotspots, and areas with high access to sunlight will also be used to house generators for renewable energy sources. So our solution has many aspects of it that improve and facilitate a circular, regenerative, and equitable economy. The first is that EV production creates high-paying local jobs, as does rail electrification, which in turn increases the spending power of the ordinary consumer to buy electric vehicles. As electric vehicle production increases, so does supply by extension, and thereby can compensate for the added demand. This allows for the more efficient, more equitable transportation of people and goods. In addition, economic incentives can make EVs more accessible for local socioeconomic groups, such as taxation on internal combustion engine vehicles. The energy produced through renewables replenishes itself while cycling back into the economy for massive benefit and allowing for the regeneration of capital, considering the fact that many renewables, such as solar, are now cheaper than even the cheapest fossil fuels. Therefore, the subsidization and investment into fossil fuels can be regenerated.
Okay, and as for implementation, since we're aiming to solve such a global issue, our team decided that it would be really difficult to do a test study. So instead, we're relying on the historical examples that Ben discussed, such as California and India. So for India, like he said, railroad electrification started in 2014, and it's cost $5.5 billion so far. In California, they already rely on 54% of renewable energy sources for their energy supply. A total conversion would cost about $4.6 billion annually, but that's definitely worth it considering the costs of climate change are definitely disproportionately felt in California. Just look at the annual fires that destroy homes and village or just towns in general. So the costs of firefighting and home insurance and reconstruction would definitely be lessened from this solution. On a global scale, the switch to 100% clean energy sources would cost about $61.5 to $72 trillion, which is about 2.4 to 2 trillion annually. Again, that's beneficial because we'd have cleaner air and decreased use of fossil fuels damaging the environment. And it's definitely more costly not to make this switch, as a failure to act would cause irreparable harm to the planet. So there's a lot of benefits to making this switch and a lot of costs to not making it. Our plan, like Ben talked about, is to halt the subsidization of fossil fuels, which is $7 trillion globally, and transition those funds to renewable energy. We also would need to invest into countries that depend on fossil fuels just to allow them to develop renewable energy technologies like solar and wind capacity. And then another part of our plan of implementation is climate change mitigation, which costs about $1.3 trillion. But again, that would prevent further degradation, which costs a lot of money. And like Ben talked about, a lot of our funding would come from government organizations and NGOs. For California, that consists of the California Energy Commission. They have several programs for funding of sustainable energy sources. And the California Department of Transportation also has a Sustainable Transportation Development Grant of $54.3 million. So that would definitely help fund our project as well. And our plan definitely relies on work with national governments, as well as infrastructure owners and companies in resource extraction and railroad electrification. Without that cooperation, it would be really difficult to implement our solution. So that's a big part of what we rely on. And our 6 to 12 month plan includes expanding the electrical grid, like Ben talked about, tightening emission standards and promotional campaigns. Something we talked about a lot in our group is the use of social media. That would be really beneficial in spreading the word about how beneficial that this solution would be to the planet. And then also just reach out to potential sources of funding. And yeah, that is our solution.